The metallic click of a wine glass against marble jolted me as I pushed open the heavy oak door of the villa that once smelled of my grandfather's pipe tobacco and polished cedar. My name is Maya Thompson. I am 34 years old, and this house, this $1.8 million villa, was the one inheritance that was mine alone, carved out by a man who told me never to let anyone strip it away. Yet the moment I stepped inside after a grueling business trip suitcase still clattering on the threshold, I froze. There was my husband, Edward Carlyle, lounging on the velvet sofa, with his arm slung casually around a woman half sprawled against him. Isabella Reed, 27, with glossy hair and the smug smile of someone who already believed she belonged. They were sipping my grandfather's vintage wine, laughing at some private joke, and the television blared as if they had lived here for years. My chest constricted so hard I could barely breathe. The betrayal was not whispered or hidden. It was staged right in my living room, framed by the oil portraits of my family. Edward did not even flinch when he saw me. He leaned back further, his voice cool and deliberate, the kind of tone he used in board meetings when he wanted to make someone feel small. "Maya," he said, as if greeting an unwelcome guest from now on, "Isabella will be staying here. If this arrangement bothers you, the guest room at the Marriott downtown is always available." My suitcase handle slipped from my hand and hit the marble with a dull thud that echoed in the silence between us. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline for some explanation that would untangle this nightmare. But he only raised his glass, took a slow sip, and turned his eyes back to the woman draped across my sofa. Isabella's laugh rang sharp, cutting through me like glass shards. "You'll get used to it," she purred, as if she had every right to sit there in silk pajamas, bare feet on the rug my grandfather imported from Florence. Heat rose to my cheeks, shame mingling with rage, but my voice refused to come out. The air tasted of betrayal, thick and metallic, the kind that makes your tongue heavy and your body tremble. I thought of all the nights I stayed up balancing Edward's ledgers, supporting his climb to become a bank director, believing that loyalty and partnership meant something. Now he dismissed me in my own home, my sanctuary, the one place I thought could never be touched. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs, louder than the television, louder than Isabella's giggles. In that suspended moment, I realized something irrevocable. This was not a slip or a mistake. This was Edward showing me who he truly was, and he wanted me to watch. The villa my name etched on every deed and contract had become the stage for my humiliation. My grandfather's words echoed in my skull, a ghostly reminder. "Never let them take what is yours." My mouth finally opened, but nothing emerged except the shallow gasp of someone who understood that the ground beneath her had just split wide open. I woke the next morning in a sterile hotel room, the hum of the air conditioner replacing the familiar creak of floorboards back at the villa. My eyes burned from a night without sleep, and yet my mind wouldn't stop replaying the scene, Edward's cold smirk, Isabella's laughter, the taste of betrayal still stuck in my throat. To understand why it cut so deep, you'd need to know the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made, and the endless ways I had been told I was not enough. I am Maya Thompson, 34 years old, a senior accountant who has spent more than a decade pulling companies back from the brink with meticulous financial strategy. My colleagues call me the problem solver, the one who finds order in chaos. Yet at home, none of that seemed to matter. In my family, the spotlight had always belonged to my younger sister, Sophia. At 31, she was the golden child, the one who could crash a car and still be praised for her resilience, while I was the one who worked 2 jobs through college and was told to stop showing off when I graduated with honors. I was the one who stepped up when my parents' mortgage slipped into arrears. Yet it was Sophia who was applauded for trying her best. When my grandfather passed away, he left the villa explicitly in my name. I remember the hush that fell in the lawyer's office as the words were read aloud. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Sophia's eyes narrowed, and even Edward's hand tensed around mine. But my grandfather had looked at me with pride in his final days. "This is for you, Maya," he said. "You were always the one who understood the value of things." He wanted me to have one sanctuary, one corner of the world where no one else's opinion could drown me. For a while, Edward seemed to respect that. When we married, he was charming, ambitious, full of promises about a life we would build together. I believed him. I believed that the long nights I spent auditing his side business, the weekends I sacrificed so he could shine at work, were investments in our future. But power changed him. When he was promoted to bank director, his suits got sharper, his words colder. He began monitoring my spending, questioning why I still kept my maiden name on certain accounts. "You don't need independence," he told me once, sliding my credit card statement across the table. "You have me." Those words landed like chains on my wrists. I told myself it was stress that he would soften, that marriage meant compromise. But slowly, the walls of my life narrowed until I realized I was living in a house where every decision was measured against his pride. I think back to family gatherings where Sophia would roll her eyes at me, whispering that I was too serious, while my parents told me not to make trouble when Edward's temper flared. I remember the Christmas where I bought gifts for everyone, thoughtful ones, only to have Edward dismiss them as cheap in front of his siblings. And still, I endured, clinging to the villa as my proof that I had a place in this world that was undeniably mine. That was why walking in and seeing Isabella sprawled across my sofa was not just infidelity, it was erasure. It was Edward declaring that even the one gift my grandfather entrusted me with was nothing under his rule. Sitting alone in that hotel room, the weight of years pressed against my chest. The financial rescues, the silent sacrifices, the careful balancing of loyalty and dignity, all of it had been invisible. I had been invisible. And for the first time, a seed of something dangerous took root in me: anger. The humiliation should have ended in that villa contained within four walls, but Edward made sure it spread like wildfire. A week later, still reeling, I forced myself to attend a gala hosted by the very bank where Edward had climbed the ladder to director. It was supposed to be a professional event, one where I could maintain some sense of dignity. A reminder that I had my own reputation beyond him. I wore a simple navy gown, the kind my grandfather used to say made me look untouchable. But the moment I stepped into the glittering ballroom under chandeliers dripping with crystal, my heart plummeted. Edward was there, of course, in a tailored tuxedo, glass of champagne in hand. And draped across his arm like a prize on display was Isabella. Not hidden, not whispered about, paraded. Their entrance caused a ripple through the crowd, eyes widening, whispers buzzing. Some people glanced at me with pity, others with poorly concealed curiosity, as if I were the subject of a scandalous tabloid headline come to life. Isabella leaned into Edward, laughing too loudly, her hand tracing patterns across his chest as though marking territory. He didn't push her away. He encouraged it, smirking at the room, as if daring anyone to challenge him. My throat tightened. The villa was one thing. It was mine, my sanctuary, but this was my public world, the one place where I had respect and standing, and he was tearing it apart in front of everyone. I stood, frozen champagne flute trembling in my hand, until a colleague of mine from the accounting firm approached, her face awkwardly kind. "Maya," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward Edward and Isabella. "I didn't realize. Is everything all right?" Her words were sharp as glass. The pity stung worse than outright cruelty. I forced a smile, the kind that cracked at the edges, and told her I was fine. Fine. That word tasted like ash. Across the room, Edward caught my eye. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, some trace of the man I once loved. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold arrogance that had become his mask. He raised his glass toward me, and a mock toast, lips curving into a cruel smile. Isabella turned to look at me, then, her expression triumphant, as if this were her coronation, and I was the unwanted guest who hadn't gotten the memo. My hands clenched around the glass stem until I thought it might shatter. Memories crashed over me, the nights I sat at our dining table, organizing Edward's accounts, the times I defended him to my parents, when they questioned his temper, the hours I invested in making his career possible. And here he was, rewriting the narrative in front of an entire room, casting me as the forgotten wife, while he celebrated with a mistress who had done nothing but slip into the life I built. My colleague squeezed my arm gently. "You don't have to stay," she murmured. But I did stay, because walking out would have meant admitting defeat, and something deep inside me refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I lifted my chin, finished the champagne in one bitter swallow, and forced myself to walk across the room. The air buzzed with anticipation, like static before a storm. Edward looked at me as I passed, his smirk daring me to break, daring me to make a scene. But I didn't. I only leaned close enough to whisper in his ear, my voice steady despite the fire in my veins. "Enjoy the spotlight, Edward. It won't last." His smirk faltered for just a second, and that was enough. Because in that moment, beneath the crushing weight of humiliation, a strange clarity began to settle over me. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was war. After that gala, something inside me snapped into vigilance. Every glance, every slip of Edward's tongue became a thread I tugged at, unraveling a tapestry I had been too blind or too trusting to see before. The villa had been my grandfather's, left in my name alone, but Edward moved with the confidence of someone who believed it belonged to him. I started noticing subtle changes, papers missing from my desk calls. Edward took in hushed tones on the balcony, the way Sophia, my younger sister, suddenly became evasive whenever I mentioned finances. Sophia had always been favored, the one who could do no wrong. She and Edward had grown oddly close over the years, often exchanging little glances that suggested shared secrets. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, the kind of suspicion born from betrayal. But then small details began to stack against him like damning ledger entries. One afternoon, I drove back to the villa to pick up a box of files I had stored in my office upstairs. The house was supposed to be empty. Edward had said he'd be in meetings all day. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw Isabella's car parked neatly beside Edward's. My pulse spiked. I didn't want to go inside, not really, but something stronger than fear pushed me forward. I slipped through the side door and climbed the staircase silently. From the landing, I could hear voices, Edward's low and firm, Isabella's light, tinkling with amusement. And then another voice, one that chilled me more than theirs combined. Sophia. I pressed against the wall, heart pounding. "The deed is already in Maya's name," Sophia whispered. "You can't just—" "Watch me." Edward cut her off. "She won't fight. She never does. I'll handle the paperwork, get her signature one way or another." My blood turned to ice. Paperwork. Signature. The words dripped with menace. Isabella's laugh followed sharp as broken glass. "She's too stubborn for her own good. You'll have to be creative." I backed away, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and for a terrifying second I thought they might have heard me. But the conversation continued, their voices merging into a conspiratorial hum. I slipped out the door and into the car, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. The villa, my grandfather's gift, wasn't just a stage for Edward's affair, it was a target. He was plotting something more, something that went beyond humiliation. That night, in the sterile safety of my hotel room, I spread out old files across the bed. Mortgage statements, tax records, my grandfather's will. Every page confirmed the same truth: the villa was legally mine. And yet Edward spoke with the arrogance of someone certain he could erase me with a stroke of a pen. I thought back to his sudden interest in my signatures, the casual way he'd slipped documents in front of me over dinner, telling me they were routine forms. How many had I signed without reading in full, trusting him? How many traps had I already walked into? Suspicion curled tight in my gut, heavier than fear. I wasn't just fighting a cheating husband. I was standing on the edge of something larger, a web of deceit that reached further than I dared to imagine. And if I didn't start pulling harder at those threads, everything, my villa, my independence, maybe even my freedom, would vanish. I couldn't sleep. The hotel room's humming air conditioner was no shield against the thoughts crashing like waves in my mind. Edward's voice kept replaying. "She won't fight. She never does." That was who I had been to him, the silent accountant wife, who smoothed over every mess, who signed where he pointed, who carried the weight so he could parade success. That night, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. The next morning, I drove back to the villa. My stomach twisted as I pulled into the driveway, seeing Edward's sleek black sedan glinting in the sun. Isabella's car was gone. Good. I didn't want an audience for what was about to happen. My hands were steady as I unlocked the door, the weight of my grandfather's keys grounding me. Inside, the scent of expensive cologne and stale wine lingered in the air, a violation of what once smelled of cedar and pipe smoke. Edward was in the study, leaning back in the leather chair that had been my grandfather's, scrolling on his phone like he owned the air around him. He didn't look up until I closed the door. His smirk spread slowly. "Maya," he said smoothly, as if he'd been expecting me. "Back already, Marriott, not to your liking." I ignored the jab. "I know what you're doing," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know about the paperwork, about the villa, about Sophia." For the first time, his smirk wavered. His eyes flicked to mine, calculating, then narrowed. "You've been eavesdropping." "I've been surviving," I shot back. "And I won't let you turn this house into your trophy. It's mine. My grandfather left it to me. You know that." Edward leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice dropping into the tone he used when he wanted to intimidate. "Maya, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You've always been good at playing support. Let me handle this. Sign what I put in front of you and you won't have to worry about anything." My laugh came out harsh bitter. "You mean I won't have to worry about you stealing the only thing that's ever been mine? I've signed enough blind for you, Edward. Not anymore." His eyes darkened. The charm slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "Careful," he said, his words measured. "You're making a scene in your own home." The audacity of it, calling this his scene, this home, his ignited something in me I hadn't felt in years. Rage, yes, but also clarity. "This is my home," I said firmly. "Not yours, not Isabella's, and certainly not Sophia's. If you think you can bully me into giving it up, you've forgotten who I am." Edward stood abruptly, the chair scraping back against the floor. He was taller, broader, used to looming over people. For a moment, a flicker of fear crawled up my spine. But then I remembered the look on Isabella's face at the Gala Sophia's whisper in the hall, Edward's cruel toast in front of dozens of witnesses. Fear hardened into resolve. He stepped closer, voice low and venomous. "Don't test me, Maya. You don't have the stomach for a fight. You never have." I met his gaze steady and unblinking. Then maybe it's time I learned. The silence stretched between us thick with everything unspoken. For once, Edward didn't have a clever retort. He only clenched his jaw, eyes flickering with something that looked dangerously close to doubt. I turned and walked out before he could recover my heels, striking the marble like a gavel. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also stronger. Outside, the air was sharp with autumn filling my lungs like a vow. Edward thought I was weak, predictable, easy to manipulate. He thought wrong, because now I wasn't just suspicious, I was certain. And certainty was power. Driving away from the villa that morning, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles blanched white. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the silent shadow in Edward's world. I felt the faint stirrings of something else in awakening. It wasn't loud or triumphant, not yet. It was quiet, steady like the first spark of kindling catching flame. I parked near Lake Michigan, staring out at the choppy water, my breath fogging against the windshield. For years, I had told myself survival meant peace, that staying silent, smoothing over compromising, was the price of keeping the people I loved close. But love had been a leash. Edward wielded it, my parents enforced it, Sophia benefited from it. And where had it left me? Standing outside my own villa, my own life, as if I were the intruder. The realization struck sharp. I had spent more time justifying other people's behavior than protecting myself. Every "don't make trouble" from my mother, every "she's fragile" excuse for Sophia, every controlling word Edward dripped into my ear. I had absorbed it all like gospel. But gospel is truth. And this was not truth. The truth was this. I was 34 years old, a professional who managed millions in assets for corporations who trusted me more than my own family ever had. I had saved businesses, negotiated contracts, navigated crises. And yet I had let Edward convince me that I wasn't capable of standing on my own. The absurdity of it burned, and then it cleared into focus. For the first time, I saw the villa for what it really was. Not just a house, not just my grandfather's parting gift, but a symbol of everything I had allowed others to take from me. Control, voice, autonomy. Edward thought he could strip it away because I had always let him. But that era ended now. I rolled down the window, the wind biting against my face, and said it out loud just to hear the sound of my own conviction. No more. 2 words small in the air, but they rooted deep inside me. That afternoon I began organizing. I dug out every old box of records I had kept over the years. Tax filings, property deeds, notarized letters from my grandfather. I laid them out across the hotel bed, color-coded files like I did at work. Each document was a shield. Each line of ink was proof that Edward's power was not absolute. For once, the fear that had always followed me was edged with something new. Determination. Edward had counted on my silence, my compliance, but silence is not loyalty. It's absence, and I was done being absent in my own story. By the time the sun sank into the lake, streaking the horizon in bands of fire, I knew I couldn't undo the years of letting others write my script. But I could seize the pen now, and once I did, the story would never be the same again. I didn't know all the steps yet, but I knew this Edward had declared war when he brought Isabella into my home, and war demanded strategy. I didn't sleep much the next few nights. Instead, I spread every file I owned across the hotel bed until the room looked less like a place to rest and more like a war room. Spreadsheets, photocopies of tax filings, my grandfather's will, even the scribbled notes I had taken years ago when he explained why he wanted me to have the villa. Each document became a brick in the fortress I was quietly building. The accountant in me, meticulous obsessive about details, took over. I color-coded folders, cross-referenced signatures, highlighted discrepancies. And the more I organized, the clearer the picture became. Edward had been maneuvering for years, quietly moving funds, slipping papers across the dinner table, asking me to sign routine forms without reading. I had been complicit in my own erasure. That realization didn't crush me. It fueled me. Because now I wasn't just suspicious. I had proof. I needed more, though. Paper alone could be explained away forged twisted. I needed allies. My first call was to Denise Parker, a colleague from my firm who owed me a favor. She was brilliant, ruthless in negotiations, and most importantly, discreet. When I explained my situation in cautious detail, her response was immediate. "Maya, you need an attorney. A real one. Not just a friend with spreadsheets." She gave me a name. Andrea Foster. Andrea was exactly who I didn't know I had been waiting for. In her mid-40s, with sharp gray eyes and a voice that carried authority, she radiated the kind of calm that made people underestimate her until they didn't. I met her in a quiet corner booth of a downtown cafe, sliding a thick folder across the table. She flipped through the documents silently, her pen tapping once-twice against the paper. Finally, she looked up. "You've got him," she said, "but we're going to need to tighten this into a noose." Those words sent a shiver through me, but not of fear, of relief. Andrea instructed me to start gathering everything. Emails, text messages, call logs. Patterns matter more than single incidents, she explained. A single forged signature can be dismissed as an error. A trail of deceit becomes undeniable. So I dug deeper. I pulled old phone records. I backed up emails onto encrypted drives. I even searched through the villa's office while Edward was away one afternoon, my hands trembling as I snapped photos of documents with my phone. That was when I found a draft transfer deed with my name scrawled in a signature that looked eerily like mine, but wasn't. My stomach flipped. He had already started forging. I emailed the photos to Andrea immediately. Her reply was curt. "Good. Chain of custody matters. Keep originals untouched." Next came the hardest part, confronting the emotional evidence. I scrolled back through years of text messages from Edward. The gaslighting was all there in black and white. "You're overreacting. Stop being dramatic. If you loved me, you'd trust me." Words that had once left me doubting myself now looked like nails in his coffin. I cataloged them screenshot by screenshot until my phone's storage nearly burst. Then something unexpected happened. My colleague from the gala, the one who had whispered pity into my ear, called me. "Maya," she said hesitantly. "I don't know if this helps, but I overheard Edward talking with Isabella at the event. He bragged about how you'd fold like you always do." "I'm willing to testify to that if it comes to it." Her words nearly undid me. For so long, I had felt invisible, but now piece by piece, people were seeing the truth. I wasn't done. I wanted every angle covered. I requested access logs from the villa's security system, each timestamp a potential witness. I pulled credit card statements tracing charges Edward had made in Isabella's name. Designer clothing spa trips a weekend in Miami, all funded by accounts that technically belonged to both of us. Andrea reviewed everything with the precision of a surgeon. "We're not just building a divorce case," she told me one evening as we sat surrounded by files. "We're building fraud, asset misappropriation, and attempted forgery. Edward doesn't just lose the villa in this scenario. He could lose everything." Hearing that didn't make me giddy. It made me steady. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. About showing Edward, Sophia, and even my parents that silence had never meant weakness. Still, I couldn't shake the heaviness. One night, as I sorted through another box of files, I found an old photo of my grandfather sitting on the porch of the villa, his arm draped around me as a child. His handwriting was on the back, for Maya. "Because you'll always protect what matters." Tears blurred the words, but beneath them was steel. Protect what matters. That was what I was doing now. By the end of the week, my war room was ready. Evidence organized, allies aligned, strategy forming under Andrea's guidance. Edward thought he was orchestrating the play, but what he didn't know was that I had already shifted the stage beneath him. And as I zipped up the final evidence binder, sliding it into a black leather case, I whispered the words that had become my quiet mantra: "Evidence never blinks." This wasn't just preparation, it was the beginning of his end. Andrea's office was nothing like Edward's study. Where his reeked of ego mahogany desks polished until they blinded you, trophies lined up like soldiers, Andrea's space was spare, functional, almost austere. A single framed degree on the wall shelves stacked with case files and a desk that was more war table than ornament. It suited her. We sat side by side, paper spread between us like cards in a high-stakes game. Andrea tapped her pen against one folder. "We have enough to prove fraud and attempted forgery, but timing is everything. If we move too soon, he'll scramble. Too late, and he might succeed in pushing a forged transfer through. We need a trigger point, something public." Her words made my stomach twist. I knew Edward thrived on appearances. He loved control, loved being the one to dominate a room. If we were going to expose him, it had to be in the very arena where he felt invincible. "What about the board meeting next month?" I asked. "The annual review. He'll be front and center." Andrea's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Perfect. We prepare a quiet submission to the district attorney in parallel. If he tries to deny, we already have criminal channels primed." The thought sent a chill down my spine, but also a pulse of satisfaction. Edward's arrogance would be his undoing. For weeks, I lived two lives. By day, I carried on as if nothing had changed. I went to work, smiled politely when colleagues asked about Edward, endured the sympathetic glances with a straight spine. By night, I worked with Andrea, cataloging every shred of proof into binders so thick they could crush someone's foot. We rehearsed scenarios. What if Edward claimed I signed willingly? What if Sophia testified against me? Andrea anticipated every move, and I learned to think not like a wife, but like a strategist. We even planted small traps. Andrea drafted a decoy document, a harmless lease extension with subtle markers embedded in the text. "Leave this where he can find it," she instructed. "If he alters it, we'll know his method of forgery." I tucked it into my desk drawer at the Villa Heart, hammering as I wondered if Edward would take the bait. Meanwhile, I began quietly shifting my finances. I opened new accounts under my maiden name, rerouted direct deposits, and froze joint credit lines. Each click on the banking website felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Edward hadn't noticed yet. He was too busy flaunting Isabella around town, but when he did, the damage would already be done. Sophia, though, was harder. She called me one evening, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Maya, you're not really thinking of fighting Edward, are you? It's exhausting. You'll ruin yourself." I swallowed the anger rising in my throat. "Funny, Sophia, that sounds exactly like something he'd say." Her silence on the line told me enough. She was more involved than she pretended. But that, too, was part of the plan. Let her underestimate me. Let them both think I was the fragile one. The night before the board meeting, Andrea and I reviewed everything one last time. Evidence binders stacked neatly, each tab a blade waiting to cut. The forged deed, the texts dripping with manipulation, the financial trails leading to Isabella's indulgences, and finally the notarized will of my grandfather, unshakable in its clarity. Andrea leaned back, studying me with those sharp gray eyes. "Maya, tomorrow is not just about proving him wrong. It's about showing yourself who you really are. You've done the work. Now you need to deliver it." I nodded, my hand steady on the table. For years, I had let Edward's voice drown mine. Tomorrow, I would reclaim the silence he had mistaken for weakness and turn it into power. As I left Andrea's office, the city lights stretched across the horizon like constellations. I thought of my grandfather again, his words etched into my heart. Protect what matters. Tomorrow I would. Not with tears, not with pleas, but with precision. Edward believed he owned the stage. He had no idea I had already set the trap beneath his feet. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. Rows of leather chairs encircled a gleaming table where executives murmured in low voices while screens flickered to life with quarterly graphs. Edward stood at the head, his presence commanding as always, tall, immaculately tailored voice, smooth as silk. He thrived here, where people leaned forward to catch his every word. But today I wasn't here to listen. I was here to dismantle him. I slipped into a seat near the back unnoticed at first. My heart thudded, but Andrea's calm voice echoed in my head. You're not here as his wife. You're here as the rightful owner protecting her assets. That distinction anchored me. Edward launched into his presentation numbers and projections flowing like a symphony he'd rehearsed 100 times. Applause murmured around the room when he spoke of growth strategies and asset realignment. My hands tightened around the leather binder in my lap, because hidden in his slides dressed up in corporate jargon was the villa. My villa. Listed under future assets to leverage. He wasn't just stealing from me in private. He was selling the illusion of ownership to his colleagues, staking his reputation on it. When the floor opened for questions, I stood. Chairs creaked. Heads turned. Edward's eyes widened briefly before he masked it with his trademark smirk. Maya, he said smoothly, as though greeting a guest at a cocktail party. This is a surprise. Not for long, I replied, my voice steady. I walked to the front binder in hand. Every step echoed. The silence was thick, the kind that precedes revelation. I laid the first document on the table, the forged deed with my falsified signature. Gasps rippled through the room. This, I said, my voice clear, is an attempt to transfer property that has never belonged to Edward Carlyle. The villa at Lakeview Drive was left solely to me by my grandfather. His will is notarized, witnessed, and binding. Edward's smile faltered. He tried to recover addressing the room. She misunderstands. This was simply a draft, a clerical mistake. Andrea's voice cut through the air from the back of the room. She had arrived quietly waiting for this moment. Clerical mistakes don't involve traced signatures, she said, holding up an enlarged comparison slide. This is fraud. The room buzzed, whispers flying. Executives shifted uncomfortably. Edward's mask cracked his jaw, tightening. I didn't stop. From the binder, I pulled screenshots of his texts projected onto the screen. You're overreacting. Sign it, it's routine. You'll fold like you always do. The words burned across the boardroom wall, undeniable. This isn't just fraud, I continued. It's a pattern of coercion, manipulation, and financial abuse. Edward slammed his hand on the table. Enough, he barked. His composure splintered, veins straining in his neck. You think anyone will believe you over me? Look around, Maya. These people know who I am. The silence that followed was louder than his shout. Executives looked at me not with pity this time, but with something sharper. Recognition. I drew the final card, my grandfather's will. The crisp, notarized document, the ink faded but irrefutable. I laid it down like a verdict. This is the only truth that matters. The villa is mine. Always has been. Always will be. Andrea stepped forward, then placing a sealed envelope on the table before Edward. And this, she said, her tone icy, is a copy of the criminal complaint already filed with the district attorney. Fraud, forgery, attempted asset misappropriation. Mr. Carlyle, you may want to retain counsel. Edward's face drained of color. For once, he had no words. The boardroom had shifted. Power that once orbited him now recoiled, seeking distance. His empire of charm and intimidation crumbled in real time, and I watched the man who had controlled every corner of my life stand stripped of his illusions. I gathered my papers calmly, my voice steady as I addressed the room one last time. Evidence never blinks, and neither will I. Then I turned and walked out, leaving Edward frozen in the wreckage of his own arrogance. The wheels of justice do not move quickly, but when they finally catch momentum, they grind with terrifying force. Within a week of the boardroom confrontation, Edward was served at the villa's gates. I wasn't there to see it, but Andrea recounted the scene with clinical precision. 2 deputies' papers in hand, his arrogant disbelief curdling into rage as they explained the charges: fraud, forgery, and attempted misappropriation of assets. Isabella stood on the porch in her silk robe, eyes wide, clutching her phone as though she could call someone powerful enough to undo reality. No one came. The courtroom months later was a different kind of stage, less polished than Edward's boardroom, but infinitely more consequential. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the walls painted a dull beige that did nothing to soften the tension. Edward sat at the defense table, his once impeccable suits now hanging looser as if arrogance itself had been his tailoring. Beside him, his high-priced attorney shuffled papers with a strained smile. Across the aisle, Andrea radiated calm authority, her folders stacked like artillery. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the stand with my grandfather's will clutched in my hands. My voice did not shake as I spoke. I laid out the timeline the villa left in my name, the sudden appearance of forged documents, the coercive texts, the pattern of financial manipulation. Andrea projected exhibits with clinical rhythm, side-by-side signatures, screenshots of texts, timestamps from the villa's security logs. Each piece was a nail hammered steadily into the coffin of Edward's defense. His attorney tried to twist the narrative, suggesting I had signed the draft willingly, that perhaps I had simply regretted it later. But Andrea was ready. She presented the decoy document, the one Edward had tampered with after finding it in my desk. The embedded markers revealed his exact method of forgery. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gavel came down once to silence the murmurs. Edward took the stand in his own defense, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the man I once loved, the charm, the smile that had once convinced me to believe in him. But charm has no place under oath. Andrea dismantled him question by question, leaving his arrogance exposed for what it was, entitlement without evidence. His temper flared, and in that flare, the jury saw not a wronged husband but a man accustomed to control now unraveling. When the verdict came, the room was hushed. Guilty on counts of fraud and attempted forgery. Sentenced to 8 years with restitution for legal costs and damages. The words echoed through me like a release valve opening. 8 years. Not just numbers, but time, a measure of accountability Edward had never imagined he would face. Isabella did not return to the villa after that day. Sophia stopped calling, though rumors trickled back that she tried to spin herself as the victim, claiming she had only been misled. My parents sent a single letter urging me not to make this worse for the family name. I didn't reply, because this wasn't about their comfort anymore. This was about truth. As I left the courthouse, reporters swarmed their cameras, flashing questions flying. I didn't give them much. Only one line, the same one that had guided me since the beginning. Evidence never blinks. And for the first time in years, I felt what my grandfather must have hoped: I would not just vindication, but ownership of my home, my choices, my voice. Life after the verdict felt strangely quiet at first, like the silence that follows a storm. For months, my existence had been consumed by evidence meetings with Andrea, courtroom dates, and the ever-present weight of Edward's shadow. And then he was gone. Not dead, but absent, his power stripped by a prison sentence that left him a name on a docket rather than the looming figure who had dictated my every move. The villa was mine again in every sense. The first time I walked through its doors after the trial, sunlight spilled across the floorboards, dust floating like gold in the air. It smelled of cedar again faintly, as if the house itself was relieved. I opened every window, letting the wind sweep away the stale remnants of Edward and Isabella. For the first time, I felt the house breathe with me instead of against me. The community reaction was mixed. Neighbors whispered, some with admiration, some with skepticism. A few stopped by with casseroles, their sympathy laced with gossip, while others crossed the street rather than meet my eyes. That didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the woman I saw in the mirror. Not the quiet accountant wife who folded under pressure, but the woman who had stood in a courtroom, told the truth, and won. Sophia tried once to re-enter my life. She showed up unannounced at the villa, her voice syrupy with practiced sorrow. Maya, I never meant for it to go this far. We're sisters. We should fix this. I stood in the doorway, the heavy oak door between us, and shook my head. You chose your side, Sophia, and I chose mine. I closed the door gently, not with anger, but with certainty. Some doors are meant to stay shut. My parents' letters continued, each one more desperate than the last. Family above all, my mother wrote. Think of the name, think of Sophia. But I had thought of them for decades, twisting myself into silence to preserve their comfort. Now I thought of myself. I placed the letters in a box I never opened again. At work, colleagues treated me differently. There was respect in their eyes, not pity. Some confided that my case had inspired them to face their own silent battles, an abusive manager, a controlling partner. One woman whispered as she passed me in the hall, "Because of you, I filed for divorce." Her words settled over me like a crown I hadn't asked for, but one I was proud to wear. The villa became more than a home. It became a place of renewal. I turned the study once Edward's lair into a library, filling it with my grandfather's old books and new volumes on law, resilience, and women's rights. On weekends, I hosted small gatherings for women in the community, those who whispered their stories of betrayal and control. We shared wine laughter, sometimes tears. Slowly, the house that had been a symbol of my humiliation became a beacon of empowerment. Some nights I still woke from dreams of Edward's voice, his sneer, his words meant to cut. But instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. Because I had faced him, exposed him, and survived. Those memories were not chains anymore. They were lessons. As autumn returned, the lake outside the villa shimmered under fading sunlight. I stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, and whispered my grandfather's words once more. Protect what matters. I had. And in doing so, I had discovered that what mattered most was not just the villa, but me. Healing didn't arrive like a sunrise all at once and blinding. It came slowly in pieces like shards of glass being swept out of a room one by one. At first, I mistook the quiet for emptiness. Waking up without Edward's schedule dictating mine, without the constant hum of anxiety in my chest, felt foreign. But with time, that quiet became space room to breathe, room to grow. Therapy helped. I found a counselor who listened without judgment, who helped me untangle years of gaslighting and guilt. For so long, I had equated silence with strength, obedience with love. In that safe room, I learned that real strength was speaking, and real love was never conditional. Each session was another stitch closing wounds I had thought would bleed forever. The villa became my sanctuary again. I painted the walls lighter, planted wildflowers in the garden, and restored the porch swing where my grandfather once sat with me. On cool evenings, I'd sit there with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, feeling the rhythm of the lake waves against the shore. It was as if the house itself whispered back, "You belong here, and no one can take that away again." But healing wasn't just about reclaiming space. It was about reclaiming purpose. I returned to my accounting work sharper and more confident than before. Colleagues began seeking me out for mentorship, and I realized how many women around me carried silent battles similar to mine. That's when the idea took root. With Andrea's encouragement, I launched a nonprofit initiative, Quiet Strength. It offered workshops on financial literacy, legal resources for women facing controlling partners, and most importantly, a community where their voices would not be dismissed. The first meeting was small, just 5 women sitting in my newly renovated library. But their stories mirrored my different details, same erasure. Together we built something out of the fractures. Every month more women came. Some brought friends, some brought their daughters. One evening a young woman clutched my hand and whispered, "Because of you, I left him before it was too late." I thought of my grandfather, then his faith in me, his gift of the villa. Protect what matters. This was what he meant, not just walls and deeds, but lives, dignity, truth. As for Edward, he faded into the background of my life. Letters arrived from prison full of bitterness, pleas, or accusations depending on his mood. I never opened them. They sat unopened in a drawer, irrelevant. Sophia drifted further away, her absence no longer a wound, but a scar I had made peace with. Family, I had learned, is not defined by blood, but by respect and love freely given. One autumn evening, I invited the women from Quiet Strength to the villa. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped into the lake, the air crisp with change. Laughter spilled through the air, mingling with the scent of coffee and cinnamon. Looking around at their faces, strong scarred but unbroken, I felt something rise in my chest. Not anger, not grief, but peace. I raised my mug, my voice steady. We are not defined by what was taken from us. We are defined by what we choose to protect and who we choose to become. The porch hummed with the quiet agreement heads nodding, smiles blooming. In that moment, I wasn't just the woman who survived Edward. I was Maya Thompson, the woman who fought, who healed, and who built something lasting out of ruin. And as the stars began to prick the sky, I whispered the words that had carried me from silence to strength. Evidence never blinks, neither do we.